Good afternoon, and welcome to this virtual discussion on green building finance and evolving landscape. I'm Jayshree Mendes, editor Construction Week, and we would like to let you in on the immense knowledge you will gain today after hearing our global industry experts. Let me tell you a little bit about CW and IFC. Construction Week, published by ITP Group India, is an international magazine printed in more than 5 countries. We are also known for our Construction Week awards that have largely become popular and is attended by more than 800 people. Besides this, we have a presence in more than 650 cities across the country. Globally, ITP Media also publishes more than 80 magazines such as Arabian Business, Alan, Esquire, Grazia, Time Out, etc. Today, we come together with International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. IFC has long-standing experience providing green finance to various sectors, including the construction sector. Additionally, they provide support to developing government policies such as green building codes and setting standards for high-performance buildings through the innovative green building certification program called EDGE that we will learn more about today. Let me introduce you to the moderator for today, who will take you through some fascinating questions and some equally captivating insights into what the world needs to do to stay sustainable. Atif Syed, South Asia Lead, Green Buildings, EDGE Green Building Market Transformation Program, Climate Business Development, IFC. He has supported mandatory green building codes for 7 national and local governments and facilitated green building code compliance for over 18 million square meters of build space. He is currently facilitating certification of more than 100 projects using IFC's EDGE Green Building Certification. A trained architect and building sustainability expert, Atif previously worked with Johnson Controls in USA as an energy program manager. He has over 18 years experience consulting governments, building developers, and designers on resource efficiency. Welcome, Atif. While Atif will take over from here, I have a request from the audience that if you have any questions to ask our panelists, please put it in the Q&A box and not in the chat box. Thank you. Well, over to you, Atif.
Thank you, Jayshree. And welcome to all esteemed panelists and friends who have joined this conference, this webinar. You might have seen recent reports on droughts, on wildfires, on flooding around the world. And I'm sure some of you may have felt that these kind of reports are increasing in frequency. And this urgency of doing something to prevent that is actually exacerbated by this new report that came out of United Nations called the Ipcc, the climate change report that is often produced every few years. They look at impact of climate change and the reasons behind climate change and what can be done to remove it, to reduce the change in climate. And one of the key aspects that they've been identifying in the previous report as well as this report is building sector. Building sector has been identified as key to greenhouse gas emissions, as a key emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, both in its construction stage as well as in its operational stage. And greenhouse gas emissions, as you very well know, are responsible for a lot of the climate change that's happening. The good news is buildings also offer one of the best opportunities, the most cost optimum opportunities for reducing the rate of climate change. Because once you design a building well and build it well and operate it well, it gives you those kind of benefits, those savings throughout the life of the building. Fortunately and unfortunately, finance is a key driver for that decision making, whether a building is green or not. And to learn more about that, we've got a very good panel today of people who come from different perspectives, different angles of green building finance. Green finance in general, and some of them have been focusing a lot on green building finance. So we have 4 excellent panelists today. And can we have the slides for the introduction, please? So firstly, we have Manu Ratra. Manu is the CEO of IIFL Home Finance based in Delhi. Manu holds a master's in management and a bachelor's in architecture. So an excellent combination of understanding of the buildings as well as of the finance that goes to build it. So he's I won't read out the whole introduction. You can read it, but Manu has been leading IFL Home Finance for the last few years, and it is mostly focused on retail loans. And his intent is to build IIFL Home Finance into a fintech, green, affordable housing finance company that believes in impact creation financially and socially. So, very importantly, green is already part of his company's mission and vision. So, welcome, Mono, and we'll come back to you with some questions later. Let's move to the next one. Now, this is again coming from the commercial banking side. We have Viksit Lamba, who joins us from Hong Kong. Viksit is the Director of Real Estate Finance for Global Banking at HSBC, Hong Kong Shanghai Bank in Hong Kong. He is leading the real estate finance, as it says in his role. And he has executed real estate financing transactions in multiple countries across Asia and Australia, and is the product lead for India. So it'll be really great to hear from him about his perspective, his bank's perspective on what they're doing in green building finance. Let's move to the next one, please. Viksit, congratulations, and thanks for joining the call today. Next, we welcome Sakar Mavandia. Sakar is working with CDC, which is UK government's development finance institution. So more on the public side here. He leads their real estate and manufacturing investments in South Asia. He's previously worked in different private equity funds as well, over 18 years of experience investing and managing across different asset classes. So currently, Sakar is the Director of Equity, Manufacturing, Construction, and Real Estate at CDC India Advisors Private Limited. So welcome, Sakar. And lastly, from a development institution, from IFC, International Finance Corporation, World Bank Group, we have Prashant Kapoor, who is the Chief Industry Specialist for Green Buildings and Green Cities. Prashant is an entrepreneur who created the Edge platform that we'll be talking about today, which is meant to mainstream resource efficient buildings in emerging markets. And he is also leading the Apex Green Cities program that supports transition of cities to low carbon and resource efficiency. And under his leadership, IFC has created a green buildings portfolio that currently totals more than $6.4 billion. So Prashant is also an architect with a specialization in resource efficiency. So welcome, Prashant, to the call. We'll go to these esteemed panelists quickly, but before we do that, I want to just talk a little bit about what I am doing in the sector and what IFC is trying to bring about. And I have a short presentation that I'll show quickly, which is introducing the Edge program that we have launched in India a few years ago. And I hope you can all see my screen. Not yet, I guess. Edge is a program that IFC, International Finance Corporation, where I work, has launched roughly about 8-9 years ago. Edge is an acronym. It stands for Excellence in Design for Greater Efficiencies. But before I go into the Edge program, let me tell you where we stand in terms of our organization. IFC, as was introduced, is part of the overall World Bank Group, which has multiple components. Our division, IFC, focuses mostly on private sector development. And our focus, our overall goal at the World Bank Group is to reduce poverty and increase shared prosperity. And over the last decade or so, we've identified climate change as one of the very clear dangers and risks that is out there, especially for the emerging markets, for in terms of their economic and social development. So we came up with this green building program as part of our fight against climate change, and we have 4 components in our program. Firstly, being a financial institution, we have investments in green buildings, and we do that directly through our balance sheet to green building developers and even to manufacturers sometimes. We also invest with local financial institutions like housing finance companies on green building products such as green mortgages and green bonds. And sometimes we also get involved in policy making along with the government. Like was mentioned earlier, we worked with a few governments in developing their mandatory green building codes. So these are the mandatory minimum standards that every developer has to follow. And we also work on incentive policies in certain regions. And lastly, we have worked with the EDGE certification, which is a way to set standards for high performance buildings. And this is a scalable voluntary standard that we have developed for the global audience, but primarily keeping the emerging markets, the developing countries in mind. And I'll talk more about what that standard really entails in a bit. In terms of what we've achieved so far, so globally, we've invested close to about $6.8 billion in green building investments. Close to 1.6 of that, 1.6 billion has happened in India. And also another 135 million with local financial institutions. We have been working with several central and state government agencies in India as well, including MOEFCC, the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Climate Change, and also state governments on developing incentives. These incentives could range from extra floor area to property tax rebates, etc. Some of these are in place, some of them are still in development. And lastly, for the EDGE certification system, globally, we have a 64 million square feet global footprint. So these are square meters footprint. These are buildings that have been certified or are in the process of certification throughout the world. And about 10% of that is coming from India currently, with about 6.5 million square meters. So you can see this number has been significantly increasing, rapidly going up in the last 2 to 3 years. That's because the awareness of green building has really gone up, and the need for change is really now becoming more and more apparent. In India, we've also grown quite rapidly in the last 2 years. And as you can see on the map, our projects are spread throughout the country and all sorts of projects. We have housing projects, retail projects, hospitals, warehouses, and a lot more that are coming up soon. Very importantly, we have worked with some global finance standard institutions such as GRISP, ICMA, Climate Bonds, and CDP on aligning their standards, their criteria for green investments. And we'll be talking more about some of these standards hopefully later today. But our EDGE system is very closely aligned with these, which really means that if you are looking for green finance from any of the international agencies, then you have to typically follow one of these standards. And to comply with these standards, EDGE is one of the most easy ways that you can get. And for a green bond issuance, EDGE can be used in multiple stages. I won't go into the detail here, but it can be used to establish the criteria as the second opinion for the allocation and reporting process as well. So what really is EDGE certification? It is a very focused standard that looks at 3 aspects of resource efficiency in the building. Is your building using at least 20% less energy than a local benchmark? Is your building using at least 20% less water against a local benchmark? And is your building using 20% less materials? And materials we quantify through their embodied energy, the amount of energy used to extract and create and manufacture those materials. That's quantified. And if all 3 criteria are being met, then this building would qualify for an EDGE certification. And this is all calculated through a free online software that we have developed. And I'll show a screenshot of that. So if you meet the 2020 standard in energy, water, and materials, you qualify for the EDGE certification. And then if any project goes beyond on the energy side and goes up to 40%, they can meet the EDGE advanced standard. And lastly, once the building is built and it is able to meet all its demands, all its energy demands through renewable sources, whether they are installed on site or procured from offsite, they can get an EDGE zero carbon, meaning they have a neutral impact, a zero impact on carbon emissions, on climate change by doing that. So that is an operational part of our certification that is available once the building is operated at least for 1 year. The certification is available for all building types, pretty much all building types, whether they are new or existing or they're being retrofitted. Except for heavy industrial, you can see almost every building type here. And sometimes we often work with large portfolio owners, which have multiple properties, and we help them do it at scale. We have two certification partners in India, Sintali SGS and GBCI. These are agencies that help in the actual evaluation of the project once it's being certified. So they are responsible for the auditing process and the final certificate issuance process. The online certificate, that online tool that I mentioned, looks somewhat like this, where you can very simply enter your building's basic information. The software calculates the local baseline, the benchmark against which you will be evaluated, and it gives you a very powerful information, but in a very simple user interface of where your building stands with regards to the utility cost. How much would your energy and water bills be? Incremental cost, if you're improving the building to meet the standard, how much extra are you going to spend to meet that standard? What the payback would be, and what the environmental impact would be as well. So this is all available. If you go to edgebuildings.com, you have a lot of information available there, including this free online software that can be used for any number of projects without any payment. Once the project decides to certify, then they have to go through that payment process for the certifiers. I'll just quickly show you a glimpse of some of the projects that have been certified recently. This is a project, I just bring this up because this is a developer in Vietnam who's actually benefited quite significantly by going for an EDGE certification. They got involved right in the early design stages, and once the building was built and they were launching their product, launching their apartments, they did a showcase of all the green features and the benefits those green features will provide to the end users, the homeowners. And by doing that, by highlighting those features, they were able to increase their sale 3 times over within a span of 3 months. And that obviously means they were able to roll over their stock much faster and go to the next project. And because of all their achievement, they even won the International Financial Times award in 2018. So we have quite a few different kinds of projects. This is just showing a glimpse of some of those. There are warehouses, student housing, children's hospital, hotels, etc. And as you can see, we are not limited to only the high-end projects. We look at low-income, affordable projects as well. And if you go to our website, you can see much more detail on each of those projects. To summarize, we have brought together this international system with a local baseline, made it simpler, and enable a simple cost-benefit analysis with our cost calculator, and ease of use. So the online software allows you to evaluate your building very, very quickly, and then align it with the international standards for climate finance, green finance. So you're able to access those as well. So I'll stop here and then move over to our panelists, because we have a lot of knowledge here in this panel, and it would be great to actually get some insights in what these individuals are doing and their organizations are doing. So let's start with Viksit Lamba from HSBC Global Markets. So Viksit, could you please share if HSBC, if your company has a separate allocation of funds for green investments? And if you do, then what are the key characteristics or key criteria that is used for accessing that green finance?
Thanks, Atif. And again, hi to all the panelists and people attending. HSBC as an organization, very publicly, we've disclosed that our own intent is to achieve net zero by 2050 or earlier. Globally speaking, we have allocated, or our target is to finance up to $750 billion US dollars to 1 trillion, to help clients who may be transitioning to a green asset or green financing world. Aside from that, I think you mentioned climate change at the start. In addition to that, invest into new technology. We've got allocation of $100 million US through various platforms that the bank has, not just financing, but also our asset management arms. And very inward looking, I think ourselves, our own supply chain and our own operations, we've set that same sort of net zero emissions target by 2030. So I guess to summarize, we see the need, for green financing, and to certain clients. I know this is rarely to do with construction and green buildings, which we can talk a bit more about. But in general, around the climate and green strategy, the bank set itself a quite an ambitious target, which we hope to achieve.
Great, thank you, Viksit. That's very heartening to hear that a commercial bank has set those ambitious targets and are progressively moving towards achieving those targets. Let's move to Sakar Mavandia with CDC. Sakar, could you please tell us very briefly about CDC, about your organization? What do you do? What are the main activities, especially as they relate to the real estate sector?
Thank you, Atif. So first of all, I would like to thank IFC and Construction Week for organizing this event and inviting me for this discussion. Glad to be part of this panel to discuss a very important topic that is core to what we do at CDC. CDC is the UK's development finance institution, wholly owned by UK government. It invests in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia with the aim of supporting economic development to create jobs. CDC has been investing in India since 1987. We take a flexible partnership approach and provide capital in all forms, including equity, debt, mezzanine, fund of funds, guarantee, to meet business needs and to achieve development impact. We invest in multiple sectors like infrastructure, financial institution, consumer and healthcare, food and agriculture, technology, manufacturing, and real estate. Climate action is priority for CDC. Our climate ambition could be explained across three key pillars. First is target to achieve net zero emissions from portfolio investments by 2050 or earlier. Second, improve climate adaptation and resilience in CDC geographies. And third, support a just transition to the future low carbon economy for workers and communities. So to give you a few examples of investments that CDC has done, CDC has invested in one of the largest budget hotel operators in sub-Saharan Africa to address the shortage of business enabling infrastructure across the continent and in some of the world's most challenging countries like Mali, Togo, Cameroon, etc. CDC has also invested in an affordable housing platform in India. The investment will play a catalytic role in promoting commercial investment in low-cost residential real estate in underserved Indian states. CDC has recently invested in a pan-India industrial logistics platform to develop green warehouses. These would be IFC certified warehouses. It would help in creation of green logistics ecosystem in tier 2-3 locations and create jobs. Going forward, we would continue to invest in similar themes. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakar. It's again very heartening to see that green finance is flowing not just in the signature projects, in the really high-end projects, but even budget hotels, affordable housing, and warehousing. So thanks for sharing that, Sakar. I'll move on to Manu Ratra, CEO of IFL Home Finance. Manu, could you please tell us about the initiatives your organization is undertaking on the green finance front?
Yeah, thanks, Atif, and thanks IFC and Construction Week for inviting me over. Although we are a typical housing finance company, but I think we have tread a different path in the last few years, where we have taken a very keen interest in understanding the sustainable affordable housing landscape in India and what we can do about it. About 4 years back, when we realized that this is a subject which is of great importance globally as well, and a great opportunity also to contribute value in this, we studied the market and we tried to understand the gaps in this whole ecosystem. And although this topic has been discussed a lot at different forums, but India is a very peculiar market in terms of housing, especially affordable housing. It's a very fragmented market. More than 50 to 60% is a self-construction market, maybe more than that in some locations. So it's a very, very granular and a segmented market it is. So we realized and we plotted the gaps which are there in the ecosystem, and we found there were 3 gaps typically which were there. One was lack of knowledge to the right kind of people who were developing such affordable homes. Second was understanding of the certification process and the procedures for that. And third was how could financing play an active role to stimulate this this whole gamut of things in affordable housing for sustainable. And the fourth was government incentives. Even the government incentives were fairly, developers were pretty ignorant of that. So we created a platform which we called as Kutum, and we started inviting. We've already done 6 chapters of it, and on this platform, the audience was the developers, affordable housing developers across various cities in the country. On this platform, we invited them over. On the other side, we had the certification entities. We had, which thanks to IFC and Edge, we started off with them, collaborating with them to do these workshops. And we had a very famous sustainable architect as well, Mr. Ashok Lal, who's been with us right through, who talks about design elements which need to be taken care of. And then finally, we were talking about the financing part as well. In the later editions, we also added to the materials aspect as well. So it's been a pretty interesting effort from our side to do this. And we have covered over 600 developers across the country. And then we went further and we incubated another specialized cell within us, where we call as Green Value Partners, wherein we said, if you are interested while you attend the Kutum, how do you take it forward and how are you going to handhold them and walk them through the entire journey of creating green certification. So we have an in-house team today of green sustainable architects who engage with these developers and who help them for pre-certification to the design. And so as we speak today, we have nearly 50 such projects across India, which are under the umbrella of Green Value Partnership, which we think is a kind of initiative which we have taken to show the path to the rest of the people to take this forward. And finally, I would just like to say, basis this also, recently we have also have a MOU signed with the Asian Development Bank for a technical assistance, which will be covering these gaps which I just mentioned about. So it's first of its kind from ADB also, maybe in the South Asia as well, as much my information goes. So it's another initiative with their impetus coming in, with their resources coming in. We'll take this to a larger scale. So we want to be a housing finance company which is developing the sustainable, affordable segment in a much deeper way, affecting the lives of millions of people who want to buy new homes. So that's a bit about it. Back to you, Atif.
Thanks, Manu. I really like the systematic approach that you've taken with, and especially trying to tackle the biggest issue of awareness through different means, through your Kutum initiative and the others as well. Thanks for sharing that. Next, we go to Prashant Kapoor from IFC. So Prashant, you were the main driver behind IFC Creating It Certification. You were the initiator of this whole process. Could you tell us a little bit about why that was done? What was the need for this Edge platform?
Sure. Thanks, Atif. And it's great to have this diverse panel, actually, just to have the various parts of this. So thanks for arranging that. So just a little bit of context for those who may not know IFC. We are the private sector investment arm, right? So we work with, private sector, and our primary role is to see development through finance work with developers, local banks, infrastructure companies, and also government. So it's sort of a broad aspect. And given the fast pace of growth of the building sector in emerging markets, we noticed that actually, if we don't kind of deal with them early on, we'd be locking in inefficiencies for years to come, right? And given that climate change is such a big impact, locking in inefficiencies, is a bad idea, right? So when IFC started to look at the space and seeing, okay, well, how we could, that was almost a decade ago, how we could actually start to promote green buildings through our work, we found that the existing systems, labeling and sometimes even regulations in many markets were very weak, the regulations. But the labeling programs were quite ineffective for some of the emerging markets, and the kind of scale we wanted to go, because they were good in terms of creating the brand. They've done amazing work in terms of the fact that we even know what green building is thanks to some of the international labels, right? But they were mostly focused on top tier clients, and it was quite clunky for it to be scaled up at a national level. To really make a difference, we had to bring this to scale. That was on one hand. On the other hand, when you look at the building sector, and I'm sure we'll dive into that a little bit more, there's diverse, interest, right? There's a lot of different players and a lot of kind of blaming that goes on. And also the perception of cost can be quite radically different between different people. And so, for example, when we investigated this, the developers, some of them we spoke to, felt that green buildings would cost up to 30% more in terms of construction costs, when we knew that really it was about 1 or 2%. A lot of this was coming from some of the other labeling systems that had a lot more sophisticated things that were put in. And so there was this whole misconception in the market. There was also this issue about, especially in the kind of speculative space, like home developers and people doing projects to sell, there is an additional cost, right? Even if it's 1 or 2%. The question is, why should the developer absorb it when he doesn't get anything from it, right? So that was one challenge. When let's take housing, the benefit goes to the homeowners. So why should the developer pay for an additional cost for this when he's not getting the premium back, right? And if you ask the homeowners, and Manu would know this well, especially in the affordable sector, they would rather get an extra square meter, right, or square feet than go for a solar hot water system if they could choose these things. Because for them, affordability is so critical that having that extra space or having a better location outweighs any uncertainty in terms of energy and water long-term appreciation, right? And then if you ask the financial sector, at that point at least, they were very wary about the additional financing that anything would be needed. And as it is, they were worried about the non-payment risk, right? So they don't want to add something more. And in order for them to really appreciate the savings that we're talking about in terms of green buildings, they didn't really have enough capacity. And frankly, they didn't feel they had the pipeline to really understand the capacity. So this whole thing was stuck in sort of each one kind of waiting for the other to move, if you like. And so we felt that, to really address this market, we had to address each party's concern and break this circular blame. We started off, about 2011, actually, or just a decade ago, with creating a simple tool which you quickly shared, and it's free and it's online. Really starting off with our clients to really get them to appreciate, actually, yes, you can do these things and it will cost so much, and actually it will save you so much, and maybe you can use the tool to communicate to your end customers, and so on. Particularly with the hotel sector, that's kind of where we started off, right? And then quickly, clients started to like this. And we managed to ourselves increase our own funding in this space. And that started to scale up, right? Because they started to appreciate the investment opportunity. And frankly, some of the return on the investment on the green aspect was better than the asset itself, right? So, so that was a great way. And then finally, it came through a customer demand, as we were doing a lot of the housing developers, especially the affordable housing, we fund developers ourselves sometimes. And they were saying, can you give us a piece of paper that says we are as good as you think we are, right? So that they can actually use it to the end customers and actually use it to investors like Manu and others, right? So that's kind of where it started. So that's the kind of genesis of this. And we found ourselves getting into this deeper and deeper over the years. And it's been a good journey, but it's been a pretty authentic one for us. We were trying to fix one problem, and we found that actually we could actually, as a key honest broker, being able to bring value to developers, to banks, to governments, and we could actually be the facilitator for emerging markets, please.
Great, thank you, Prashant. So great to hear that you've been tackling the main impediments to this one at a time and trying to figure out a way to really scale it up and not just be a preserve of a few. Thanks for sharing that.
Arthur, maybe I can pick up on that.
Yeah,
I'd be
please.
quite keen to share something, sort of on the other side from Prashant, obviously developing that tool, which is of course very important to give us that independent certification. Again, not this one's not centric to India, but this was probably 4 or 5 years ago, not 10 years ago, as Prashant said, when he started working on certifications. But 5 years ago, we had a client who was a European headquartered client, and they were going and building some retail commercial assets in Asia, and they came to us, and it was pretty similar, where when we looked at the cost that was being incurred was much higher than what we would expect that similar asset to cost. And clearly, the additional cost was because of solar panels that they were installing. So this was a client who had sort of green in forefront 5 years ago, and as banks, we took some time to come across. Clearly, as banks, I think another panelist said we're obviously looking at non-payment risk and obviously having our loan back. But when we looked at that transaction a bit more holistically and understood what the cost is for and how that cost plays out, just as a banker, a very simple example is, and for anyone, is solar panels. That how much of your electricity can you generate from the sun? And when we looked into that, we were able to go and find reason to be able to provide that additional bit of finance, where in a typical construction loan, we would look to finance, say, 50 cents to the dollar. But in this case, because we understood that the cost base is higher, and the reason for that cost base being higher is to do with the building being green, we were able to lend a few extra cents on that dollar, which then, to what I was speaking earlier, it goes to the commitment that at least as an organization we have to support sort of green projects. And then, of course, when the project was completed, at that point of time, we didn't have any assurances that it would again, this is 5 years ago, so there was no pre-certification, which is now available. There were no pre-checks, which are now required. The edge software that you talked about, where you could make up your mind. But when the project was completed, it went to market, and it was certified by, again, an internationally recognized green certification agency as gold and platinum. So again, just to add to what Prashant is saying, it's quite right that there are certain times, and I'm sure other panelists will have different views, but coming from a banking perspective, we see that, and that's increasingly happening, and you would see appetite from banks, at least like ours, to provide that additional bit of finance.
Thanks, Viksit. Thanks for sharing that example. Viksit, I'll stay with you and ask about HSBC's portfolio, especially with regards to green buildings. Do you think that's increasing, and what's the trend like? And if you have some perspective on the India portfolio as well. I know that one of the EDGE certified projects by Indospace has been invested by HSBC. So if you could talk a little bit about your green building portfolio globally as well as in India and how that's growing.
Yeah, so to take globally first, I think as recent as last month in July, the banks got a separate sort of business unit, which is called the ESG Strategy Group. ESG obviously includes green, but also has sustainability and governance. So a host of issues, not just green certification. So there's a separate team within the bank which has been created to focus on clients and on sectors which need green financing. And that doesn't limit it to buildings, but other sectors as well. But at a 35,000 feet level, it's again something that the bank is doing globally. Truth be told, I think the sustainable bonds or green bond sector is way larger than the loan market right now. The loan market has started maturing in the last sort of 2 years, but the growth that you've seen in sustainable bonds, where you have a larger sort of investor appetite looking for green assets or green loans, is much larger. I'll leave the global bit at that because it's sort of lots of numbers. Speaking more on the India front, you mentioned, because of course EDGE had done the certification, so you're aware of the transaction you mentioned. Aside from that, I think more generally, and for people attending, who may be from developers or investors, I think there are two key things that from a financing perspective that I would want to leave people attending this with, and we've done both. So one is you try and help a client, who may be an international pension fund who's looking at investing in India, and they would be looking at assets across sectors. They're asset agnostic. However, one of the key pillars they have is to, and now increasingly over the last 2 years, and if you're investing in India and China, you want to make sure they're green because you're investing in numbers. So one of the clear themes that we're getting from certain investors is that they would look to invest in green buildings or sectors which are green. That's sort of one thing that's clearly come out. So the way to sort of do that is twofold. One, you can set up something that our bank can help with, which is setting up a green financing framework under which you identify certain assets, certain asset classes, under which if you fulfill certain criteria and the buildings that you're building or whichever, whether it's retail, commercial, logistics, what have you, meet those criteria, you can raise green financing on top of it. What that helps with is that you have one umbrella where you can raise bonds which are green, you can raise loans which are green, you can also raise I guess hybrid instrument which could qualify as green. Or otherwise, the other approach, which again we've seen some success with Singapore developer sponsors, where they're building something which is completely off the ground, completely greenfield. And at the starting point, they would come to us, and again, similar to the example I said, but in a more matured market, they would seek a pre-certification, and that specific loan for a specific asset, what is called a green loan memorandum. We could document that or, make that green just for that one project. So there are two approaches that I think people should think about. One, if you've got a portfolio of real estate assets that you want to invest in and you want them to be green, then you should look at setting up something which is a green framework. And the second is if you're looking at very much opportunistically project by project, you can also raise green loans for that specific project. And again, just to answer your question finally, so in India, of course, we've seen success with the logistics space and the office space, both greenfield and sort of brownfield, where clients have looked to acquire assets which are already certified or building assets that have a pre-certification and are likely to be green when they're completed.
Thank you, Viksit.
Actually, sorry, Viksit, when you said the framework, I suppose that's at the corporate level, right? So if you're investing at the corporate level, is that
you can also do it at a fund. You could do it at a fund level. That's very different because a lot of our clients, aside from the developer community, it can also be private equity investors. And some of the private equity investors who are coming are themselves, pension funds or government funds. Themselves have a target of investing in sustainable assets. So yes, to answer your question, it can definitely be done at a corporate level. That's possible, but you could also do it at a fund LP level.
Understood. Thank you.
Thanks. So I understand that basically green finance comes in different flavors, and it's basically up to the context of that project that really needs to be figured out which flavor suits the best. Thanks, Viksit. Sakar, I have a question for you about your typical investees. Who are they? And if you can give some examples of some of your recent green investments in India and how that's worked out. And also, does your green finance typically end up to be cheaper than conventional finance?
Yeah, thanks, Atif. I think this is a typical question. So I would like to clarify for all that green finance should not be viewed as a cheap finance or a grant money. This is a typical question that we are asked, that can you lend at 7% or 2% rate, which I think is a misconception. I think I agree that it needs to be competitive. It needs to be competitive compared to, say, bank financing or a typical private equity money. But one should not assume that it would be cheap capital or grant capital. So this clarification I would like to submit. Coming to the portfolio that we have in India. So as I mentioned, we recently invested in a pan-India warehousing platform. So they already have around 4 million square foot under development, all operational warehouses, and then they would effectively be doubling that portfolio in next 2 years. And what they are doing is all the new warehouses would be IFC certified. So we don't invest, to clarify here, we don't invest in any company unless they go with such certification. So it has to be green. There are multiple layers that we look into in an investment. We start with whether it is economically viable or not. When we say economically viable, it would effectively mean that it should create employment as well as livelihoods. Then second criteria that we see is inclusive urbanization, which means they should enable more inclusive access to social and economic benefits. And third is environmental sustainability, which will include improving your energy and resource efficiency, emission reductions, and climate resilience. So all these are actually certified through the EDGE certification that we have in our portfolio companies. Second investment that we have is an affordable housing platform. This is one of our GPs. So we are now focusing on making that platform green. But when we invested earlier, then there was always a concern. People would say that why should we invest in green buildings? It costs more. There is no payback period. There is no IRR. There is no return metrics that could be associated with that number, because you are our LPs and you are effectively pushing us to make green buildings. What is there for us? Where is the financial metrics that we can show and we will make return? So now, thankfully, we have crossed that hurdle. Now there would be numbers which will show that what other panelists mentioned, that 1 to 2% would be your incremental cost. Your payback period would be lower. And now we have seen that it is financially viable and it is financially accretive. So coming from that position of strength also helps us in convincing the developers that the thing we are asking is fair, and they will also gain in that. And I would also mention this, that this is actually our responsibility, that we need to do something for our environment. It can't be that we are only looking at, say, financial metrics. Thankfully, now financial metrics and the gap between financial metrics and your environmental consideration has narrowed down. But I think they should be in top of all the investors' mind. And I think DFIs are leading that way. They are the front runners there. But I think we would need a lot of private capital who would be funding this green revolution. So there was a white revolution. I would say this is required, because it's very serious actually. If you see, 38% of the CO2 emissions are from building and construction, and 11 to 12% is already embedded in the existing building that we have. And there is no, I think, talk about retrofitting those buildings with green solutions. So those buildings need to turn green. But I have not received any proposal currently that people are thinking about retrofitting the existing buildings, which could become serious later. We all speak about new buildings, making them green, but who is talking about making the existing buildings green?
Thank you, Sakar. I think firstly, you're sending a very strong message by investing only in green buildings. That's really important and very powerful statement. And I get your message about retrofitting, and I'm sure there'll be some people in this audience who will be paying attention to that. Manu, I have a question for you about green finance. Do you think green finance is helpful for your developer clients as well as for your home buyers? And if so, how do you think it's helpful?
Yeah, so actually, if you allow me, Atif, I'll try to take a step back and then come to this question.
Sure.
If you look at it, we need to divide opportunity or the kind of ecosystem for green finance. One is at a domestic level within the country, and the overseas money which can come into this country. So there are two different aspects to this, because it has to be a complete conduit available till it reaches the beneficiaries, right? So I think currently, if I talk about the domestic side of it, as of now, for green financing per se, whether they are the banks, we have few small examples where HSBC fund launched something on green financing. One of the leading HFCs also came up with deposit of green deposits. Other than that, there is no specific work which has happened on green financing towards the construction side. We hear a lot about renewable energy. Renewable energy has really been the low-hanging fruit for people to invest in it, right? And I think maybe it's the policy level or the nature of the complexity of the task which is there. As I always say, that India is yet to be built. So we just cannot ignore the new construction, which is going to come in a massive, massive way. And almost 3.5 to 4 crore homes are going to get built for that initiative of housing for all across. So we are a India yet to be built, is what I feel. Then let's look at the overseas side of it, and like Vikshit also mentioned about it, we need to. What I have observed is the benchmarking, right? So the kind of taxonomy which exists, which has just been taken up by in EU. So Indian certifications need to have a benchmarking with the global standards acceptable to the foreign investors. EDGE is definitely one proxy which is very widely accepted. But there are others which are there, which are more deeper. So all those need to get developed and become internationally acceptable. So a lot of work needs to be done in that ecosystem so that the green financing flows into India. Even if the intent is there, I'm sure people, Vikshit would agree with me that the investors are looking at which certification, how are you going to measure the impact? How would I get to know that where I put the money, it's going to give me the payback of what I have expected to put the money in, right? So that is fairly at a very raw stage to develop those frameworks, as he mentioned, the green frameworks, or to do that. So this is the context at the moment and the bottlenecks which are there. There's a lot of work to be done. Few of these topics we are already working on, and hopefully you might see some more first from our side for that. Now coming to the question which you asked me, green financing is something as Prashant also mentioned, is that for affordable housing, even it's a very sensitive market in terms of pricing, extremely price sensitive market. Developers are very fragmented and very local. They don't have the might and the muscle to say, okay, I don't mind, but they will like to be neck to neck. It has to be a profitable thing to them. And they won't want to even price a home 25,000 rupees or 50,000 more than their competitor, nearest competitor. They will lose out the deal. Forget about green. They said green comes later. First, I need to do sale. I need to be sustainable. I need to be competitive. And I can keep the ball moving. So it's a complex task from that standpoint. So that's what we've been trying to educate through our various platforms and programs, that they can see that the difference is very less, or if at all there is any. And we are trying to see that how we could come up with certain financing to certain developers at a concessional price relative to the other loans. As Sakar mentioned, it's not cheap money, but yeah, whatever best you can do to keep that, fill up that gap which is there. So we're seeing that, and that's why I said we have some very interesting work going on the ground, and people are interested, the developers are interested in that. Then on the demand side, the awareness level of theirs to understand this, I would say is at a fairly low level. I think so at this point in time. There needs to be a lot of work to be done for the awareness at the demand level. At the supply level, it's come up much better. So developers are aware of this, and a lot of government incentives are also getting poured in to bridge that financial arbitrage or whatever it was available area. So making it more viable to them through FSIs, to extra FSI for them to make it viable. So there's some good work happening there, but I think it's the ignorance of all the facts available to them. So very exciting times in terms of developer finance. It is definitely something they are looking for, and they are keen to do this. And the consumers, once they know about it, it's like this, if I don't get it, I don't die, but if I get it, it's nice. So at the moment, it's at level of, it's nice to have green home, but it's not, I want a green home at that level. Let's be honest there. So I think in these things, I think the regulatory changes itself will ensure this from the demand side to do that. Sometimes regulatory changes, making mandatory for it to be done in a certain way, I think is the way forward to make and ensure. Otherwise, the affordable home people, you don't expect them to be demanding to want what they want. They want a roof on their head at the moment, rather than searching for that. So let's be honest there. So I think it's a very interestingly poised, and I see a lot of bright light out there to really benefit this much more. Yeah.
Manu, just to, what you just said resonates quite well, actually. This thing about demand and the supply end, right? And the home buyer's awareness and the kind of ask is not yet totally there. I mean, it's a nice to have at best, right? But I think this is why I feel it's so critical that we, particularly in the context of India, right, to bring this kitna deti hai as a total value here, which is, I think we're missing that out here in this whole narrative of, dustbins and cycle racks and everything else. If we can focus on cost saving, comfort, and even resilience because of power cut and real value, then we are much more engaged with the end customer. And I think more than anywhere else, I think Indian customers will get it if we can parcel it well enough and there's trust in the system. I think that's the belief I have, at least. Otherwise, we just go into everybody's narrative, and there's a lot of narrative in this space. If we can fundamentally show them some value, that's really, I think, where I'm not suggesting we've got it cracked, but I think that's where we should all focus a little bit.
I think that's a very interesting segue, and thanks Manu and Prashant for raising those. Actually, we have a poll related to this. So why don't we run an audience poll, a very quick one, and then we'll come back to the panelists for one final question. Jayshree, could you please run that? Yeah. So the question is, what do you think are the biggest hurdles right now for India in getting green finance, green building finance? Is it not enough finance availability? Is it that the criteria for getting this finance is just too difficult or not very clear, too complex? Or is it that the awareness of green finance and green buildings in general is low? Or is it that there's not enough building stock to attract investors? Which one do you think is the biggest? And you can choose multiple if you think there's more than one crucial factor here. So you have about 20 seconds to respond. And once we have the poll answers, maybe we'll get back to the panelists and get some of their feedback to this as well. Okay, so I think that'll be going away in a minute. Prashant, I'll move for the next question to you. Okay, we've got the responses. Great. 77% of the audience thinks awareness is the biggest challenge, awareness of green finance. 44% thinks the criteria for accessing it is not very clear or it's too difficult. And then not enough green building stock is another challenge. And lastly, access to green finance. So people generally think there is green finance available. It's just the other factors that's kind of inhibiting access to it. So great, very interesting to hear that. So Prashant, any thoughts on that? And also, how do you relate that to India on how is the EDGE program and IFC overcoming some of these challenges in India or even globally? And if you can give with some examples.
Okay, good. So I think, just picking up from some of the narrative, right, earlier, I mean, if you'd asked me a decade ago when we started this off, there was, think about it, green bonds is a fairly recent sort of thing. We were involved in the first kind of green bond issue years ago, right? So in terms of green buildings that came along and caught up to being a participant in the green bond, that sort of pushed the market a little bit. Of course, green buildings were happening, but mostly in the commercial building space, right? I think where I feel the gap is in terms of emerging markets and some of the barriers that the poll suggested is that the kind of trust in the system, right? That so if we can have let's start with the homeowners, right? If they can fundamentally trust that this is a green asset that they're going into. And actually, let me give you an example. Actually, this project existed way before we got into this. This is Mexico. And actually, it's one of the largest banks. 60% of all mortgages go through these banks. This one bank called Infonavit, which is like a provident fund stroke bank, right? That provides affordable housing to the people. And thanks to the German GIZ, they provided some sort of seed money to kind of think about, some initial, sort of subsidy, if you like, to kind of get the project rolling. And they started to offer green mortgages, right? Without even thinking about the supply chain, nothing like that. Supply demand model. Just went green mortgages, here you go, right? Initially, it started off very, sluggishly, right? They set a criteria for a green mortgage. You need to have, this is Mexico. Remember, hot, dry, and with water issues, right? So think Rajasthan, So it has So they made sure that there was a minimum specification that was predictable. Solar hot water, some of the fittings had to be green, some lighting, some insulation on the roof, that sort of thing. And they floated it. Initially, they had like 1,000 homes out of almost 1 million mortgages they do per year, right? And then the next year jumped. So it was a logarithmic kind of jump. As people realized that these homes were in fact going to save me money. They were more comfortable because of the roof insulation. They had solar hot water, so they could easily be identified, that came with it in a way. And some of the key benefits, the home buy kind of habits completely shifted towards this, to the extent that in about 4 years of launching the program, they stopped doing any other mortgage other than green mortgage. Imagine the lower market completely shifting, and moving in this direction. There is some more to the story, which I will not go into. But right now, with the Mexican crisis in the housing space and the politics, but basically there is evidence that shows that through the financial markets, this leadership can happen if there is A, predictability, B, I feel the value in the market. So with Edge, that's kind of what is our endeavor here, right? So we're trying to bring, that's why the focus on on just looking at the things that are countable, that are measurable, that can be translated into some cost efficiency eventually. That I think is important. Ourselves, we as IFC have invested $6.5 billion, right, in green buildings, both directly and also financing banks, right? And we have co-invested with CDC in many projects in Africa and places like that, right? So we do that push ourselves. For example, in India, we've got almost 10,000 units in the supply chain that are being built Edge certified and pushing the market through our own financing directly, equity mostly, going there. Also, the debt side, we're trying to push the banks to do something. I mean, I actually one story that I would love to narrate, and I wish it was all thanks to our amazing insight. But some of these things you just have to leave to serendipity, right? But this was Bancolombia. They came to us for a green bond issue. It was a private placement, so we did $117 million with them, and they used the money to create a green construction finance product. Okay, not necessarily mortgages in the beginning, and they themselves, without it was oversubscribed many times, and I can go into that. But fundamentally, as Sarkar said, there wasn't any concession funds here. It was just pure market, value, and they themselves decided to offer 1%. Obviously, developer finance varies based on the developer. So 1 to 2% lower, developer finance rate, and about 65 basis points lower on the mortgage side. They started to develop that too. You should see what's happened, and Edge was the main criteria. Within about 2 years, we had 15,000 units. This is Colombia. This is not India, right? This is huge for Colombia. Within like two years, we've seen 8% of all new construction going Edge. So this is the power of the financial market kind of pushing this. Obviously, there was a bit of subsidy. I grant you that, and we worked a lot, a bit like what you are suggesting, Manu. We worked with 300 developers across 16 cities, trying to train them up, getting them ready, on how to do this, creating the pipeline and all of that. We call that advisory work. But that's kind of how we see this sort of, as one of the ways. I'm not suggesting it's the only way. And yet another example is Peru, where we have got nothing to do with financing, and it's just municipalities, a bit like some of them in India, kind of offering a little bit of a incentive for doing it. And in this case, it was an extra flow. If you do Edge certified, and that also has created a huge momentum. I'm not suggesting we should wait for these kind of huge incentives to break through, but it does really help, definitely, right? So when you have these markets happen. So last one I would say is is the one we did in South Africa. This is closer to what Vikshit was saying. On the fund side, we invested in a fund, equity fund, where it was purely on green affordable housing, about 2,000 units. After we did it, the KfW Bank also invested in the same to make it 5,000 units. And as the developer was creating JVs, not the developer, the fund was creating JVs with the land, developer and creating projects, the developers that were working on these projects started to appreciate the value of this. Some of these were rental housing, so we could actually collect data, and we're happy to share it at some point. And you could see that because we were able to compare rental with and without edge, and you could see the difference in energy costs, that was really getting the developers motivated. Because even though they were not directly getting benefit, they were making better assets that they could sell better, and that was transforming it quite a lot. And then more recently, again, nothing to do with us in this case, one of the large banks, actually two large banks, ABSA Bank and Old Mutual, both have started to offer green mortgage finance because there's a bit of a market. So, it can happen from many different directions, is what I'm trying to say. But obviously, finance can have a huge role in this.
Thanks, Prashant. I think what you've mentioned are some great examples, especially like the Mexico example. They stopped doing conventional mortgage. That's like a dream scenario. Hopefully, we'll see some of that happening in India as well very soon. So we just have a few more minutes left before we go to the Q&A, but I'll request all panelists, Manu, Sakar, and Viksit, if you could just share in 1 minute each, in 60 seconds each, what do you think whether India is ready for green building finance, and what do you think are the two top things that need to happen to ensure robust growth in green building finance, both regarding developer finance as well as green mortgages?
Thanks once again to IFC and Construction Week for hosting us. I think the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen some tremendous positive momentum in this, and I think we're just getting started. And we are very, very optimistic, and we ourselves have set out a target that in the next 3 to 5 years, we would cover at least 250 to 300 projects. Under this is what our mandate we have taken, and we see a great receptiveness from a lot of entities coming forward to support this. So I think very, very bright days ahead, and I think we shouldn't overlook government's initiative in this. They are coming up pretty strongly on this, and so I think it's really going to support the overall cause of things. On the top two wish lists, I would just say is that would love to see HSBCs of the world and other DFIs to look at India more aggressively on this space. And the only difference between the outside and the here is that every outside world, there's a refinance of this segment, right? India is yet to be built. So refinance has to be substituted by fresh financing for green finance. So I think that's some flexibility if it comes that way. And look at it from that perspective, a huge potential. And we are ensuring at our end that anybody who comes and works with us, they will get the global standards in terms of benchmarking, in terms of reporting. One aspect we are not discussing here a lot is about reporting, and it's about the certifiers, and it's about impact calculation. Those are most very, very important about green financing to look at. There might be the non-financial aspect, but this goes hand in hand for that. So we're working very hard on that, and I'm sure it'll be pretty good on that. So I'm highly optimistic on that, and we should see a green revolution of a different kind this time. Yeah. Thanks.
Happy to go next, Odit. So I'll pick up from Manu. He's picked up on the on the housing side of it. On the commercial side, I think India, from what we're seeing in the last 2 years, especially in the last 2 years, I think two sectors which are really primed for sort of green finance and green asset development very clearly. One is the office sector, clearly with what's happened in the last 18 months across the world. There are very different things that I think tenants want, and therefore the landlords who are building these assets, they're trying to bring a very different product market. And in doing that, I think green also becomes one of the things that they're focusing on, whereas earlier it was more that we would look at it on the side. I think it becomes forefront because green then is not just green. It's health and safety. It's the other wellness that comes with it. So I think office sector is definitely something which we are seeing increasing investment. And especially given where we are in the cycle, you're seeing a lot of announcements which are all public information about a number of international investors making investment early on in the development life cycle in greenfield projects. And because they're starting from the ground and the demand is for high-end grade A commercial office, I'm pretty confident that as that gets built out, in Manu's words, right, India is still to be built. So as that part of India gets built, I think that will definitely be green. The second side is, the more, which is non-conventional, so as to speak. And again, what we're seeing is, logistics. Of course, you're aware of Atif and Prashant. We've had logistics assets which are green. The other new sectors that we're seeing a lot of interest in is data centers and life sciences parks. And the way those assets again are built, because they're power heavy and they need to be efficient and meet certain standards, that by itself again lends itself to a green certification. So I think those two sectors and these new sectors, or the new real estate, if you want to call them, I think will be green, and we'll see a lot of interest. In terms of two things that need to happen, I'm very happy to try and be part of the solution that Manu said. I just think, more holistically speaking, not so much India, but I think globally speaking and speaking for other, all financial institutions, and I think Sarkar also touched on it in terms of it not being cheap money. I think with what we're seeing, especially in the last 6 weeks, as I think, or if you started with that, the amount of climate change and impact I have seen in the last 6 weeks, it's been more about climate change, right? It's bordering with COVID numbers now, right? So it's coming to the forefront that that sustainability is quite important. So I think we'd like to be part of that solution where we're able to provide financing at cheaper rates. But I think, again, we're a bank, we also raise money in the market. At some point of time, that reverse life cycle, that where we are raising, of course, we have deposits from customers, but that's not the only source of funding that we raise. We also go to the market and raise money. So I think it's that end-to-end sort of spectrum that we raise money, which then also gets deployed for green. And then that pot of money cannot be used for anything but green. And hopefully we can raise it cheaper and extend it cheaper. But again, I think as with everything, that there's a journey to be had. And I think the second thing, which is more myopically in India, and I think all the panelists have spoken about it, it's the incentives from the government. Because I think even the poll says, yes, there is green finance available. But what are the measures? How can that be facilitated? Whether it's a payback or it's a return or it's building additional floors or additional FSI. I think that's something that I think should really help more green buildings come up.
Yeah, I'll go next. So I call it a 4A approach, which includes awareness, availability, accountability, and award for this green finance to become mainstream. When I say awareness, it means if you see build to suit or build to hold properties, probably there is already a lot of green finance. So for building effectively offices, retail, warehousing, there is desire and intent on developers to build it, probably because tenants are asking for it. But if you see build to sell properties for residential, there is still effectively a lot of push, then a pull demand from investors. So a lot of awareness is required for that. On availability, I would say that I agree with them that there is still a long way to go. Green finance is still at a nascent stage in India. Very few products are available. So DFIs like us are taking lead on this, but a lot of private capital needs to pour in to provide the impetus to green financing. And banks should also start differentiating between green portfolio and non-green portfolio, which is currently not happening. So rates needs to be competitive for green financing. Then comes accountability. So a lot of developers say that if we have set up a green rainwater harvesting or a solar panel in the project, it should be green finance. So that I think should not be the case. There should be accountability on account of them, largely mainly on green certification. So there should be a common standard and benchmark to create that accountability. And now data is there to prove that it is financially accretive. And last is award, where I say that policy measures should be there. Like there is FAME subsidy for electric vehicles, concession loans for affordable housing. So ideally, though there is FSI benefits in GRIA, but that is to developers. But for as an end user, there could be green loans where you can find interest deduction on your income, concessional loans for green financing. Housing societies could get property tax benefit if they are retrofitting their buildings to make it more green. So if these type of measures are there by government, then probably it could become a mainstream, but I think still a lot needs to be done. And if I need to select 2 points, it would be largely policy support, and then probably a lot of private capital needs to get into this to make it mainstream.
Thank you, Sakar, Viksit, and Manu. Excellent points. I think we should move on to the Q&A session now. We have some interesting questions that have come in. So in the interest of time, I'll just pick out 4 questions of those and read out the questions and let any of the panelists respond. And if any of the panelists have any questions, please share those too. The first question that came up from a couple of our attendees, is there a database of green buildings that have accessed green finance in India? And a similar question is there a database or a list of financial institutions that provide green finance in India? How can they know which banks, which investors are providing such finance?
As of now, whatever we've been able to see, so there is no database per se available for where the people have availed of green finance. As I said to you, at least in housing, there are no special incentives or drives by the government banks at all today to differentiate any kind of a normal financing to a green financing. They are agnostic. So per se, there is no, for at least for this space of construction, there is no segmentation or any monitoring of that sort which is happening. So there's no database of that nature. As far as institutions providing green finance, I think it's again depending on the sector. Obviously, a lot of renewable on the energy side, a lot of things have happened. Mobility side, some things are happening. But as far as again coming to the construction side, very limited. Because obviously it's a complete ecosystem, some complete conduit that, okay, you are doing this and they are getting some cheaper money, and that is how it is. One of the very few examples I'd like to mention was a small bit of funding which came from AFD to National Housing Bank, and from National Housing Bank it reached out to us. That was one very rare example where some funding was available for green mortgage, but it was not even a drop in the ocean. So that's the current status. If anybody else wants to add to this, I don't know. Yeah.
No, I'll just add one snippet. Again, depending on the client that's raising finance, whether it's a private equity fund, a developer, or pension fund. One is, of course, the cost of funding. That they may not always want that to be public, but there are private channels like Loan Connector, and there is a database of sustainable bonds. Again, these are subscribed services, but not so much publicly available. So I think those two factors kind of mean that it becomes a little bit opaque.
Let's go to the next one. And maybe Prashant, you can answer this. The question is more about the criteria for green investments. Is IFC's investments linked only to EDGE certification, or would you accept one of the other local and international certifications as well?
Great. So I think the main thing, if it's my message to developers, is that just self-disclosing something as green is not enough, obviously, right? So because it leads, and this happens with architects and others as well, who think they've done the best job ever, and it's eco this and that. That's really some of the problems. So I think I feel it's important, in terms of criteria, to focus on resource efficiency in the context of India particularly, right? Because I think that is the seed through which we can talk about climate change as well as cost saving. I think that's, for us, that's why we link it at the heart of our green building program, where you're saving energy or generating energy even, whatever, that ultimately the end user has 20 to 40% lower energy bills is fundamentally what is bankable in some ways. And in the future, Manu, I think you'll appreciate this, that in the future, once we have a bit of a database, we can say, okay, the NPLs or the defaults or the delinquencies on these loans were much better than this. That's really what's going to fundamentally change the market. Without that, this is all DFIs just, scrapping at this, right? So I think that's important. And So for us, our internal criteria, this is IFC's own kind of internal criteria of what we call a climate deal. We account for this minimum standard of 20% and any internationally well-known green building standard. That's kind of how we look at it. And we kind of approach it sometimes case by case because things do change and standards do drop and go up. So we constantly improve it. And kind of adjust for that, but that's kind of a base case. So it's not just edge, just to answer that, but at the same time, we do have to maintain our risk, issues with the reputational risk of what fundamentally is done, and also the certification process. Our worry is that there needs to be a credible system where you can trust how it's being checked as a third party, and those kind of things. So we constantly monitor this for our own investments, and so through syndications, we'll end up getting others to follow the same thing. So, yeah.
The question that I'm reading here is about self-built housing. So individual houses. The question is they're asking, is that eligible for green finance as well? And how do they go about it? What's the process for self-built housing?
So again, as I said, more than 60 to 70% of people build their own homes in India.
You said 50.
Sorry?
You said 50 last time.
Yeah. So I'm saying as you go to the semi-urban rural areas, it's even more, right? So although it's coming up. So I think this is a task, I think, Atif, we have also discussed the sidelines as well, that we need to create some benchmarking of it. So I think for anything to be made into a prototype or into a scalable thing, it needs to fit into a certain parameter of sorts. And then we can say this is it. It might be already being done in terms of a lot of places you have septic tanks being done, some solar panels being there. So I think possibly we need to have a much more compact or a kind of very easy to track this as a green certification for individual homes, to be able to get them in that realm of green financing. At the moment, it may not exist at the moment for people to be able to access in that way. Although there are some attempts being done in terms of through BE, Bureau of Energy Efficiency, is trying to look at it. So there's one facility being worked with BE and KFW with SBI, right? So where they're trying to see that how that can be looked at. So I think at the moment the prototype is missing for individual homes to be classified under that, which is very simple. I'm saying there might be more affluent homes can still undergo that process. So maybe Prashant can come up with a
Sorry to halt the conversation there. But no, absolutely right, Manu. You've hit I don't know if you know, but we're working with Avas,
Yeah.
So they're exactly in the same market. And this is the $1 million question. And it's not just for India, right? I think Africa has the same thing. Self-built homes, incremental housing. How do we get to that? And suburban and rural. And so, you said it. Maybe we can package this in some fashion that makes the biggest issue is transaction cost, right? You can't ask somebody to pay, $1,000 to get yourself certified when the cost of the house is $1,000, or whatever that is. So it's really not going to be scalable in that same way. I think there may be two approaches. Perhaps BE can help in this. But I think one lead is what is happening in Europe and UK, actually. So if you look at Barclays Bank, I don't know if you know this, Vikshit, but they've come up with a way to have, mortgages linked through energy performance certificates. So just a simple energy-based performance, and it's not about green or not green, whatever your performance is, your G, you can get to F, and that's the funding. That's one that sounds really interesting from that perspective. But then, where I think there are three other sort of approaches. One is, I'm just thinking, there could be some way where we can work through the contractor that may be working on many projects, so we can upskill the contractor and come up with standards, in the design concept that could be built in, like say the chhaja and roof insulation, and simple practices that can increase the kind of construction technology, and even simple things like adding solar hot water systems and light bulbs and flush tanks, that end of it. But the other one is, and this is perhaps more refinance or kind of home equity loans part of it, you can have an energy efficiency package for appliances, which I think is the low-hanging fruit, frankly, given that BE has done such really good work on air conditioners, ceiling fans and appliances. One can come up with something where you can parcel it and say, based on just invoice-based financing, and potentially we can even link it to on-bill financing. If you can team up with a utility company, potentially we can have this paid back through the bills, right? The electricity bills. Imagine that. Okay. And the last one is, if we have a product around resilience. We tried this in Oman, in Muscat, with Bank Muscat, or Bank Oman, I can't remember. But the point is that, where the solar systems, small-scale solar hot water and solar panels were part of this incremental housing. So it could be technology linked, which is slightly more expensive. And maybe there is some package around it that says, okay, you can have this, but we need to make sure all your lights are not energy guzzlers. So there could be some way where we can link. So I think this needs to be discussed, and like Sarkar said, there isn't really a forum for us to discuss this, right? And so I totally agree. That actually new construction is important in India, but even refurbishment, we need to bring a place to discuss this somewhere in terms of the upgrades and stuff. But I think this is something that hopefully will incrementally improve as we go further. Would love to discuss, one-on-one, and maybe we can have this in your next Kutum, Manu,
sure.
as a discussion.
Yeah.
But
Interesting.
I think it should be up to us to do it, really, rather than, I think, the danger in this is to wait for NHB or the government or some regulator to do this, or RBI, which is, I think we should try and do this between us. And perhaps even go for a Chatham House format where we can just have this, closed door discussion to see what sort of things work.
Well, thank you everyone for those responses. We do have a lot more questions. Some of them are very specific project-related questions. So I'll ask them to send their specific request, and we can pass it on to our panelists if they want to respond later. But thank you, everyone. This was a very engaging discussion and really some good insights. What I'm taking away from this is that, yes, it is a challenging market. However, the outlook is quite optimistic. There are a few key hurdles that we need to address, awareness being one of them, probably the biggest challenge. But all the initiatives that I've heard today, I think they're all pointing in the right direction, that we should keep pushing for it. Market is changing, the governments are paying attention, the buyers are paying attention, the investors definitely are paying a lot of attention to this. So it's just a confluence of all those things that is coming together, and hopefully we will be catalyzing and coming to a situation like what Prashant mentioned in Mexico or Colombia, where this becomes really mainstream. That's really our dream scenario, and hopefully we'll get there soon. So thank you again, and thanks to ITP for arranging this call. And back to you, Jayashree.
Thank you so much. That was one entertaining discussion, very enlightening. We will be publishing the story, will report in the September issue of Construction Week, and also online. Meanwhile, you can wait and look forward for another webinar on possibly green buildings in October. Thank you once again.
Thank you.